My father taught third grade for 31 years at Linwood Elementary in Columbus, Ohio. Room 14. The same room for all 31 years. He had a poster above the whiteboard that said, "Every child deserves a champion." He never talked about it. It was just there, the way the clock was there, the way the smell of dry erase markers was there. He retired 3 years ago. The school gave him a plaque and a gift card to Applebee's. He seemed genuinely happy about both. He died in February, a Tuesday. His neighbor called me because my number was on a note card stuck to his refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. The neighbor said he had found my father sitting in his armchair by the window, with the TV on, a cup of coffee on the side table, still warm. That detail stayed with me. The coffee still warm. I drove 4 hours from Pittsburgh. My brother flew in from Phoenix the next morning. We hadn't been in the same room in almost 2 years, and standing in my father's small house on Clover Street, sorting through a life that fit into a 2-bedroom ranch, the distance between us felt larger than the miles. My brother's name is Troy. He's 3 years older than me and he processes things by making lists. Within an hour of arriving, he had a notepad out and was walking room to room writing things down. I stood in my father's kitchen and looked at the sunflower magnet and didn't move for a long time. The funeral was small. My father had outlived most of the people who would have come. A few neighbors, a retired teacher named Harriet who had worked at Linwood for 20 years and cried harder than anyone. 2 men from his Tuesday bowling league who stood quietly in the back and left before the reception. And 1 woman I didn't recognize. She was older, maybe late 60s, with gray hair cut short and a posture that made her look like she was used to being the tallest person in any room she entered. She wore a dark coat and didn't sign the guest book. She stood near the back during the service and didn't speak to anyone. Afterward, at the graveside, when most people had already drifted toward the parking lot, she walked over to me. She said her name was Judge Lorraine Hess. Retired, she said, like the word was something she was still adjusting to. She said she had known my father for a long time and wanted to pay her respects. I thanked her. I wasn't sure what else to say. My brain was doing that thing grief does where everything feels slightly underwater. She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a card. It was plain, cream-colored, with a name and a phone number printed on it. The name was Mitchell and Byrne, with an address in Denver, Colorado. She said, "Your father asked me to give you this when the time came. Call them. Tell them you're Leonard's daughter. They'll be expecting to hear from you." She said it the way you'd say something that was simply true. Not dramatic. Just a fact she was delivering. I looked at the card. Then I looked up, and she was already walking away. Troy saw the card that evening. We were sitting at my father's kitchen table with takeout boxes between us, and I set it down next to my coffee cup without thinking much about it. He picked it up. "Mitchell and Byrne," he said. "Who's that?" "A law firm in Denver. A woman at the funeral gave it to me. She said Dad asked her to." "What woman?" "A retired judge. She said she knew him." Troy looked at me for a moment. "Dad didn't know any judges." I didn't have an answer for that. He set the card down and went back to his food. "Probably nothing," he said. "Probably some clerical thing. A pension rollover or something." I picked up the card again and looked at it. The name on it, below the firm name, was a partner named Conrad Byrne. I called the next morning. The woman who answered was professional and calm, and did not seem surprised to hear my father's name. She asked me to hold. I sat on the edge of my father's bed and looked at the sunlight coming through the curtains he had probably not washed in years. A man came on the line. He introduced himself as Conrad Byrne and said he had been waiting for my call. He said that as I was the named executor and primary beneficiary, there were documents he needed to walk me through, and that if I was able to come to Denver, it would be easier to do it in person. I said, "Beneficiary of what?" He paused. "Not long, just long enough." He said, "Your father's estate is more complex than you may be aware. I'd rather not go into detail over the phone. Can you come to Denver?" I said yes before I fully understood what I was agreeing to. I didn't tell Troy I was going. That sounds worse than it was. I just needed to understand what I was walking into before I involved anyone else. I told him I had some things to sort out back in Pittsburgh and I would call him in a few days. He was already making arrangements to head back to Phoenix, already in logistics mode, so he didn't push. The Mitchell and Byrne office was on the 16th floor of a building near Colfax. The kind of building with a lobby that echoes. A receptionist walked me to a corner office with a window that looked out over the city, and the mountains in the distance, still capped with snow in late February. Conrad Byrne was in his 50s, trim, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook my hand and poured coffee without asking if I wanted any, which I appreciated. He set a folder on the table. He said, "Your father came to us 11 years ago. He had already been doing this informally for about 6 years before that. He wanted to formalize the structure, give it a legal foundation that would outlast him." I said, "Doing what?" He opened the folder. Inside was a document with a name on the cover page. The Room 14 Fund. I looked at that name for a long time. Conrad explained it. My father had started setting aside money in 1997. Quietly, steadily. He had noticed that some of his students came to school without adequate supplies, sometimes without adequate food. He had started buying supplies himself, at first just for his own classroom, then for other classrooms. Then he had started something more deliberate. Over the years, working through a small network of contacts he had built carefully, including Judge Lorraine Hess, who had served on a county education advisory board, he had developed a system. He identified families in specific circumstances. Families where a parent was ill, recently incarcerated, or simply stretched too thin to manage. He made sure those children had what they needed: school supplies, winter coats, eye exams, tutoring, in some cases grocery assistance through a partner organization he had connected with in 2004. He never told anyone his name. The families knew the fund existed. They didn't know who had started it. I sat in that chair and looked at the folder and tried to reconcile the man described in these pages with the man who had eaten the same oatmeal every morning for as long as I could remember. The man whose big annual expense was an MLB package so he could watch the Reds lose in peace. Conrad said, "Over the past 17 years, your father contributed approximately $400,000 to the fund through a combination of personal savings, modest investment returns, and 2 small life insurance policies he maintained." I heard myself say, $400,000. The current fund balance, after disbursements, is approximately $260,000. I set my coffee down. He lived on very little, Conrad said. Not with judgment, just as a statement of fact. His expenses were minimal. The house is paid off. He drove the same truck for 14 years. He cooked most of his own meals. He made deliberate choices consistently for a very long time. I thought about the Applebee's gift card, the sunflower magnet, the 31 years in room 14. I thought about how I had never once heard him complain about money. Conrad gave me time. He didn't rush me. He explained the structure of the fund, how it was administered, what the named disbursement partners were, what my role as executor would involve if I chose to continue operating it. He said, "Your father named you specifically because he believed you would understand what he was trying to do." His words, in the letter he left with us, were that you had always understood that doing something quietly was not the same as doing something small. I asked if I could read the letter. Conrad slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name was on it in my father's handwriting, that particular handwriting I knew from birthday cards and grocery lists left on the counter. I held it in my hands and didn't open it. Not yet. I asked Conrad about Judge Hess. He said she had served informally as an advisor to the fund for the past decade. She had helped my father navigate some of the more complex cases, families caught in legal situations, custody arrangements, things my father couldn't address alone. She had never taken a fee. I asked why she hadn't said any of this at the cemetery. Conrad smiled slightly. She said you would have questions. She said she would rather you came here first and then asked her. I called Troy that night from my hotel room. He answered on the second ring. I could hear the TV in the background. I said, "You need to sit down." He said, "Why? What happened?" I told him about Denver, about Mitchell and Byrne, about the fund. There was a silence long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. He said, "How much?" I told him. Another silence. He said, "So there's an estate. Real assets that have to go through probate." I said, "Troy, I'm just saying, as the estate, it would be split according to..." "It's not part of the estate," I said. "It was never his money. He gave it to the fund. He structured it that way intentionally." Conrad explained it. "It's a legally established charitable fund. The money belongs to the fund, not to us." He was quiet. "He left us the house," I said, "and about 40,000 in savings. That's what goes through probate. The fund is separate." I heard him exhale. "He spent his whole life," Troy said, and then stopped. Started again. $400,000. He drove that truck with the cracked dashboard until the heat stopped working. He stopped again. "I know," I said. "He should have told us." I thought about that. I thought about my father sitting in his armchair by the window, his coffee warm on the side table, not telling anyone. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it only worked because he didn't." Troy didn't say anything for a while. Finally he said, "Those kids. Did they know? Do they know now?" "They knew the fund existed. They didn't know it was him." "Huh," he said. "Just that." Quiet, like something was settling in him. We talked for another hour. Not about logistics, just about our father. About things we remembered. Troy told me about a time in high school when he had gotten into some trouble. Not serious trouble, but the kind that could have gone sideways, and our father had handled it without raising his voice, without making Troy feel ashamed. Just quietly arranged what needed to be arranged and never brought it up again. "That's who he was," Troy said. "That's exactly who he was." Before I left Denver, I called Judge Hess. She answered the way you answer when you've been waiting for the call. We met for coffee the following morning at a place near her home in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. She was already there when I arrived, sitting with her hands around a mug, watching the street outside. I sat down and she didn't waste time with small talk. She asked me what I wanted to know. I asked her how she had met my father. She said it was at a county education forum in 2008. She had been on the advisory board and he had come to present some data about resource gaps in lower-income classrooms. She said he was the only teacher in the room who brought actual numbers. Everyone else brought opinions. He had a spreadsheet. She smiled when she said it. She said they stayed in touch after that. She said my father was methodical in a way she respected. He didn't act on impulse. He studied a situation before he moved. He asked careful questions. He was not interested in recognition. She said that last part seemed almost unusual to her in her experience, because most people who did good work wanted someone to eventually know about it. "He didn't?" I asked. "He wanted the work to continue after he was gone," she said. "That was the only thing he cared about, not credit, continuation." I looked at my coffee. "He talked about you," she said. "He said you were the stubborn one." He meant it as a compliment. I laughed. "It came out a little ragged," she said. "He said your brother was good at getting things done, and you were good at understanding why things mattered. He thought you were better suited for this." I asked her if she would be willing to stay involved. As an advisor. Whatever form that took. She looked at me steadily. She said, "Why do you think I drove 2.5 hours to be at that funeral? I drove back to Columbus instead of flying. I needed the hours. I stopped once for gas in Lehman, Colorado, standing next to the truck in the cold air, looking out at the flat land in every direction. The sky was enormous. My father had loved the Midwest, had never understood why people wanted to leave it. Everything you need is right here, he used to say, and I'd always assumed he was talking about the landscape. I was starting to think he meant something else. I went back to the house on Clover Street. I had a key. I let myself in and stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on the lights. The sunflower magnet was still there, a few of his coffee mugs on the counter, a library book on the table that was overdue. I sat in his armchair by the window, the one where his neighbor had found him. I opened his letter. It was 3 pages, written by hand, in that familiar handwriting that tilted slightly to the right. He apologized for the surprise, and I could hear the dry humor in it, the way he could make an apology sound like a gentle tease. He explained his reasoning, not to justify himself but because he thought I deserved to understand. He said he had been afraid at first that structuring it formally would somehow change it, that giving it a name and a legal framework would make it feel like something he was doing for himself rather than for the kids. But Conrad had helped him see that structure was what protected the work after you were gone. He said the fund needed someone who wouldn't be impressed by it. He underlined that. Someone who would treat it like a responsibility and not a monument. He said he trusted me to figure out the rest. The last paragraph was short. He said the library book on the table was mine if I wanted it. He had thought of me when he checked it out and hadn't gotten around to finishing it. He said not to feel bad about returning it late. The fine would be small. I sat there until it got dark. The library book was a collection of essays about ordinary lives: teachers, sanitation workers, nurses, postal carriers. People who showed up every day without anyone watching. I returned it 2 weeks later. The fine was $1.40. I paid it. The fund still operates. Conrad's office manages the administrative side, and I review everything quarterly. Judge Hess is still involved. She sends me a short email every few months with a note about a specific case she thinks warrants attention, and I have yet to disagree with her judgment. Troy came back to Columbus last spring. We sold the house on Clover Street eventually, but not quickly. We sat in it first for a weekend, just the two of us, going through things the way you can only do when you're not in a hurry. He found the spreadsheet on my father's old laptop. 17 years of data, every disbursement, every family, every specific need that had been met. No names, just case numbers. But the details were there. A child who needed glasses in 2003. A family who had lost heating in January of 2009. A girl who had tested into a gifted program but couldn't afford the materials required. Troy sat with the laptop for a long time. He said he knew all these kids. I said he taught their parents. He nodded slowly. Room 14, he said like he was reading it for the first time. My father had 31 years in that room, hundreds of kids. And somewhere along the way, probably quietly, without making a moment of it, he had decided that the classroom was just where it started. I think about the coffee, still warm on the side table. I think about a man who left for work every morning carrying more than anyone knew, and came home every evening and set it all down without mentioning it, and sat in his chair by the window and watched the street, and was at peace with everything he had done and was still doing, right up until the moment he wasn't. He left me a structure. He trusted me to learn the rest. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that February, not in any formal way, just the way you do when you're sitting with something that won't let you go. My father made a choice in 1997, a small one probably. He saw something that needed doing and he did it, and then he kept doing it, and the thing that started as a quiet impulse became a structure that outlasted him. That's not luck. That's not accident. That's what happens when a person decides, over and over again, to act on what they know is right instead of waiting for someone else to act first. I think about the version of him that could have existed, the one who spent that money on a nicer truck, a real vacation, a kitchen remodel he probably needed. Nobody would have blamed him. He earned it. He had every justification. But he looked at what he had and looked at what some of his kids didn't have, and he made a different calculation. He made it so many times it stopped being a calculation and became just who he was. That's the thing about character. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up consistently in small decisions that nobody is watching. My father understood that. I don't think he thought of himself as a person of unusual virtue. I think he thought of himself as a person who had figured something out that worked, and he stuck with it. Conrad told me that my father had said he wanted someone who wouldn't be impressed by what he built. He underlined that in the letter. And when I first read it, I thought it was humility, or maybe a gentle warning not to get self-congratulatory about the whole thing. But I've come to think it meant something more specific. He wanted someone who understood that the work was the point, not the story about the work, not the feeling you get from being associated with something meaningful. The actual work, continuing, without anyone needing to feel good about it. That's harder than it sounds. We're all, I think, quietly hungry for acknowledgement. Even people who say they aren't. My father either wasn't, or he had learned to feed that hunger somewhere else. In room 14, maybe. In the daily fact of 31 years of kids who learned to read, who learned that an adult would show up for them reliably and without condition. Troy and I talked about this when he came back to Columbus. He said he used to think our father was just uncomplicated. Simple tastes, simple life. He said now he thinks our father was the most intentional person he ever knew, and the simplicity was a choice, not a default. I think Troy's right. What I took from all of this, if I'm being honest, is something I'm still learning to do. It's easy to care about things in the abstract. It's easy to feel strongly about what the world should look like. What's hard is the daily, undramatic work of making small decisions that point in that direction, even when no one is watching, even when the results won't be visible for years, maybe ever. My father did that for 17 years before he formalized it. He did it without a name on it. He did it because he had thought carefully about what he was capable of and what he owed to the world he lived in, and he had arrived at an answer he could live with. That's what I want to be. Not impressive, not recognized, just consistent, in the way that actually changes things. The fund is still running. I reviewed the disbursements last month. A child in Columbus got a winter coat and a backpack and a new pair of glasses. My father would not have mentioned it,